let's raise the question of U.S. policy, particularly during the Bush administration.
Yeah.
Some critics of the policy towards Africa point out that it created this notion of the securitization of development in Africa,
Yeah.
where in actual fact U.S. interests in Africa were presented in the manner which you have, but really behind that was this question of security, particularly counterterrorism. Is this a fair assessment?
No, it's not, and not in any way, shape, or form. I think it's just it's a misreading, because I mean, how do you say that significant U.S. assistance going to Namibia was about counterterrorism, right? Or for that matter, to South Africa was about counterterrorism, right? I mean, I think that really people who try to have some type of overarching, well, there has to be a reason why the U.S. government increased its aid levels so significantly under the Bush administration. Then they're going to say, well, it has to be this or that. But really, it's about, Secretary Powell coming to Africa, coming in May of 2001, i.e. 5 months into the administration, seeing people dying across this continent, right? President Bush understanding that as well. And they saying, actually, HIV and AIDS is an emergency situation. We have to do significant assistance. It's about African countries actually carrying out the economic reforms that were necessary. And President Bush saying, let's do aid differently.
But wouldn't you say that your policy, particularly in the Sahel region,
Yes.
did have aspects of this security concerns, the concerns around weak and fragile states really being havens for terrorist elements?
Yes.
You cannot discount this, can you?
Of course, no. I think the point is that there's no one variable that explains all of U.S. policy. Certainly our policy in Africa had to do with security, particularly after 9/11, where it was a focusing event for a brand new administration. And so the concerns, especially in East Africa and the Horn of Africa and across the Sahel on the security were very real.
Yeah.
But they were also about HIV and AIDS and health, right? Addressing what was clearly a killer across the continent. They were also about a better way to do economic development and foreign assistance. You remember we pushed the G8 to change its way of doing assistance. Before, the focus was on give more, give more, give more. And President Bush said, no, we actually have to look at what are countries doing with the aid, right? There has to be a mutual responsibility between the donor and the recipient. And so we want to make sure that there's more input, but we also want to see what the output is of that aid. And so that was the Millennium Challenge account, which had nothing to do with counterterrorism, but
also at the same time, what we did see from African states was almost a suspicion of U.S. intentions in Africa. And I asked this because of there was this concept of AFRICOM,
yes,
the establishment of an African standby presence in Africa, which was resisted outright by many African leaders.
Yeah.
Was this due to suspicion?
Well, no, but you see there was a big misunderstanding about AFRICOM. Yes, of course, there's always going to be a suspicion about Western countries in Africa, right? This imperialism, a new imperialism. So that's an accepted fact. But AFRICOM was about a reorganization of U.S. forces. It wasn't about a change of our presence. Whether we were European Command or Africa Command, we had the same presence, right? It was just a matter of saying there's no reason why Africa should be falling under the European Command. So we reorganized our command structure. So it wasn't so much about, a new focus on Africa. Although that was the case across the entire policy, it was about the seams in how the U.S. engages the world. And we had 3 different commands engaging Africa: European Command, Pacific Command, and Central Command. So 3 different commands had Africa. We said it doesn't make sense, just put it under one command. So that was Africa Command. Now, the issue about a vast resistance, certainly the South Africans didn't want Africa Command, but not every other country didn't want Africa Command. There were other countries that actually wanted its presence, i.e. a base in their country, and so it was a back and forth really.
But others at the same time would also argue that maybe the presence of U.S. bases within your proximity indicates a clear and present danger to the livelihoods of African states, in the sense that that presence might indicate something more insidious in terms of intentions towards the African continent.
Why?
Well, in this, let me give you an example, ma'am.
Yes.
The idea that U.S. military bases allows for the United States to project its might into areas where maybe African states are not so welcoming of such a military presence.
But we don't need a base to project our might. That's the misconception, that somehow a base is going to help you project your might. We can project our might without a base. So no, I mean, to be honest with you, even the only place where we have a real permanent presence right now is in Djibouti. And that has nothing to do with Africa. That actually has to do with the Middle East.
At a perceptive level, you don't see any dissonance with the fact that a foreign Western country would want a military presence in Africa?
No.
Somewhat imperial, wouldn't you say?
No, I don't think it's imperial at all. I think, like I said, I think African countries want to think that it's imperial, but no one's trying to colonize Africa anymore. I mean, let's be honest, So I think that idea, is it's of the past, is the way I would put it. I think it's of the past.
Now, ma'am, it's high political season in the United States.
Yes.
You're about to go into an election.
Yes.
Just in review, in conclusion, how would you characterize or describe Africa policy during the Obama administration? There was high hopes in Africa because of his African ancestry that we might see a more nuanced approach. Has that happened?
You haven't seen an approach. I would characterize it as anemic. Almost non-existent. It's been very good for Secretary Clinton to come to Africa. I think that I appreciate her attention to the continent, but the president himself has been missing in action. He's done very little, if anything, to promote coherent Africa policy, to show any level of serious engagement. So I'm disappointed. I'm very disappointed in the president personally, and in the administration more generally. And like I said, I think Secretary Clinton has done a lot in coming to the continent. I think other cabinet ministers, Ron Kirk, finally got the AGOA extension done. But overall, I think that it's been really 4 years of anemic policy.
Dr. Frazer, thank you so much for joining us on Africa 360.
Thank you. My pleasure, Chris.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.